In the summer of 588 BCE, Jerusalem still stood behind massive stone walls, its Temple Mount a silhouette against the skyline. Within those walls lived a population who believed their city was secure. Stores of grain, layered fortifications, priests, and prophets. 18 months later, that confidence had been shattered. From an estimated 75,000 inhabitants, fewer than 10,000 remained. This is how Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed Jerusalem. Not merely by a single assault, but by a calculated combination of diplomacy, logistics, engineering, and psychological warfare. A campaign recorded in the biblical witness and visible in the archaeological record. To understand how a relatively small city met its end at the hands of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, we must first look at the map. Jerusalem sat at a geopolitical crossroads. To the west, the Nile and Egypt. To the east, the tides of Mesopotamia and the rising power of Babylon. The city lay near key trade arteries that linked the Levantine coast to interior routes leading toward the Tigris and Euphrates. Control of Jerusalem meant control of a choke point on commerce and a symbolic foothold in the wider struggle between empires. Nebuchadnezzar II ruled an empire that prioritized strategic depth. He was not simply a conqueror reacting to every rebellion. He sought to secure lines of communication and to deter rival powers. From Babylon's perspective, Judah's position, its occasional leaning toward Egypt and its intermittent defiance, was intolerable. The kings of Judah across several decades alternated between submission and revolt. Each act of defiance threatened Babylonian authority in the region and invited countermeasures that were as political as they were military. The principal actors in this drama are known to us by name: Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, also called Jeconiah, and Zedekiah, the successive kings of Judah. The prophetic voices, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, whose books record interpretations and laments, and Babylon's military officers, including Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard who would later oversee the city's fall and the temple's destruction. The primary narrative of the campaign appears in 2 Kings 24-25, Jeremiah 39 and 52, Ezekiel, and Lamentations. Together, these texts form the biblical framework through which the events were preserved and interpreted. But Nebuchadnezzar did not begin with battering rams. His campaign unfolded in phases and began, crucially, with a diplomatic and educational strike aimed at Jerusalem's future leadership. In 605 BCE, after the Babylonian victory at Carchemish and the consolidation of their power west of the Euphrates, Babylon demanded from Judah a selection of the royal youth and nobility. Young men from the royal family and the upper classes were taken to Babylon, among them Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who appear in the book bearing Daniel's name, Daniel 1. The biblical record in 2 Kings and Daniel presents this as an organized program. Youths were removed from their native environment, placed into the king's service, and trained in Babylonian language, culture, and court practices. This was hostage diplomacy with a difference. By removing promising leaders and exposing them to Babylonian education, Nebuchadnezzar sought to undermine the future elite continuity of Judah. These were not only hostages to be exchanged, they were investments in a generation likely to be loyal to the empire. The effect inside Jerusalem was psychological as much as political. A city that had relied on its royal lineage and priestly class to preserve its identity now saw those resources diminished. The first blow was subtle and long-term, a hollowing out of potential leadership and a daily reminder that Babylon could reach into the court of Judah. Less than a decade later, the pressure escalated from hostage-taking to direct intervention. In 597 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar returned. The city resisted, but the king at the time, Jehoiachin, surrendered. The biblical record reports a large deportation. 10,000 were taken from the city, including the king, the royal family, officers, craftsmen, and skilled artisans. People needed to run a society and maintain its defenses, 2 Kings 24, Jeremiah 52. The captives were relocated to Babylon. The conqueror replaced Jehoiachin with a new ruler, Mattaniah, who was given the name Zedekiah and placed on the throne as a vassal. This first major siege and deportation accomplished several objectives simultaneously. Militarily, it removed seasoned military leaders and technicians. Economically, it stripped Jerusalem of the artisans and administrators necessary for recovery. Politically, the installation of a puppet king signaled that Judah's autonomy had been curtailed. The city was not yet destroyed. It was, in many ways, being emptied of the structures that sustained it. Biblical passages such as 2 Kings 24-25 and Jeremiah 52 present these events as fact, while other sources and archaeological layers corroborate a pattern of displacement and administrative reconfiguration. But hollowing out a society does not end resistance. The third and fatal phase began when Zedekiah, installed as a vassal, chose to rebel, encouraged, according to the records, by an Egyptian diversion. To the Babylonians, that rebellion could not stand. The final siege, traditionally dated from 588 to 586 BCE, demonstrates the patience and the resources of Babylonian military planning. This was not a brief clash of arms. Nebuchadnezzar encircled Jerusalem, severed supply lines, and methodically weakened the city over time. The siege lasted approximately 18 months. The tactic was clear: isolate, starve, and then use engineering to exploit any weakened point in the defenses. The mechanics of the siege deserve careful attention, because they reveal how strategy, engineering, and logistics, not mere brute force, brought the city down. Babylonian armies employed several methods common to ancient siegecraft, and some that were innovations of scale. Encirclement was the first step. Babylonians built lines of circumvallation, earthen and timber ramparts and ditches to prevent sorties and to keep supplies from reaching the besieged. These lines were sustained by a rotation of troops, with units alternating duty to maintain pressure around the clock. Maintaining a siege of this length required planning: food supplies for the besiegers, fodder for animals, and secure lines for reinforcements. Siege towers and battering rams came next. Siege towers, often built of timber and covered to protect against arrows and missiles, served as mobile platforms from which soldiers could threaten walls at height or provide a protected way to place ladders. Contemporary reconstructions and scholarly estimates suggest some towers could reach significant heights, perhaps on the order of tens of meters, sufficient to match the elevation of city walls. Battering rams, sometimes manned and sometimes drawn by a team of strong animals, focused kinetic force on a single gate or wall segment until masonry fractured. A critical and brutal component of sustained sieges was mining and sapping. Sappers dug tunnels beneath walls and used fire or collapse tactics to undermine foundations. When subterranean supports burned out or were removed, the wall above would fall, creating a breach. Ancient engineers coordinated these operations alongside surface attacks to fix defenders in place while undermining their defenses. Another instrument was starvation as a weapon. Calculations in modern studies show that a city's ability to resist depends on its provisions, population size, and access to water. Jerusalem had been provisioned for sieges in earlier periods, but the removal of arable hinterlands and the control of access routes by Babylon reduced the food available for defenders and civilians. Biblical texts and later prophetic literature record the terrible results: famine, disease, and a breakdown of social order. Lamentations portrays a city under such stress that ordinary norms of care and kinship strained to breaking point. See Lamentations 4. These testimonies are not military manuals. They are literary witnesses to human suffering under prolonged deprivation. The siege's gradual pressure culminated in a breach. On a date commonly associated in the scholarship with July 18, 586 BCE, the wall of the city was broken. The biblical narrative describes the fall. Defenders were overwhelmed, the king attempted to flee, and the city was taken. Zedekiah fled by night, likely trying to escape to the plains, but he was captured. The records tell with chilling brevity what followed. The sons of Zedekiah were executed before his eyes. He was then blinded and taken in chains to Babylon, 2 Kings 25, Jeremiah 52. The punishment was both personal and public. a demonstration that rebellion would be met with total retribution. Once the city fell, Nebuchadnezzar's policy turned to complete dismantling. Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, oversaw the burning of the temple and the palaces. Jeremiah and 2 Kings record that the temple itself was set aflame and dismantled. Sacred objects and treasures were taken back to Babylon. The biblical record explicitly locates these events and dates. The burning is traditionally dated to early August 586 BCE, when conflagration finished the symbolic destruction. Looting was not haphazard. Ancient imperial campaigns often moved with bureaucratic efficiency when it came to seizure and transport. The text in 2 Kings and Jeremiah speaks of large convoys and a systematic removal of valuables, chests of treasures, implements used in worship, and temple riches that represented both monetary value and symbolic authority. The biblical account mentions wagons and organized transport. Later, historians and archaeologists have treated those reports as signs of an intentional program to absorb spoils into the imperial economy. One ancient source mentions 500 wagons used to carry the spoil. Modern scholars debate the exact number and logistics, but agree that the seizure represented a significant economic transfer from Judah to Babylon. The human consequences were immediate and long-term. Many inhabitants were killed during the assault. Many more were taken into exile. Those deported included the social elite, craftsmen, scribes, and priests, people who carried institutional memory and cultural practices. Others remained in the land as a remnant, some placed under Babylonian appointed officials to manage agriculture. The pattern of deportation and resettlement served a dual purpose. It punished rebellious provinces by removing their elites and repopulated imperial lands with labor and expertise where needed. The trauma is reflected in the prophetic books. Jeremiah mourns and records the fall with bitter clarity. See Jeremiah 52 for a chronicle-like account. Lamentations, traditionally ascribed to Jeremiah's circle, is a poetic meditation on loss, portraying a ruined city and a people bereft of hope. Ezekiel, who writes from exile in Babylon, sees the catastrophe from the other side. A captive prophet addressing a community in displacement, attempting to make sense of deportation and loss within a theological and prophetic frame. These texts do not simply report events, they interpret them. For the prophetic authors, the destruction was wrapped up with covenantal failure, theological critique, and calls to moral and religious reflection. To modern readers, they provide both historical testimony and a record of a community grappling with meaning in the wake of catastrophe. At the same time, we must attend to the archaeological and material record. Excavations in Jerusalem and surrounding sites have uncovered destruction layers, burned debris, and evidence of abrupt abandonment in layers corresponding to the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE. Pottery styles, collapsed architecture, and changes in urban planning all corroborate a phase of violent interruption. Objects found in Mesopotamia, including artifacts that bear stylistic markers of Judean workmanship, suggest that material culture from Jerusalem and the region was transported eastward. While archaeology cannot supply motives or interpretive frameworks in the way prophetic literature does, it confirms the broad outlines of a severe and swift upheaval. We should address the numbers carefully. The figure of 75,000 reduced to 10,000 appears in later summaries and should be treated with caution. Some of these statistics derive from biblical summaries and may compress complex demographic changes into striking figures. Where specific numbers are given in the text, for example, counts of deportees or references to the size of convoys, the scriptural record is our primary source. Modern historians use those figures as starting points, but add caveats. Ancient population estimates are notoriously difficult, and the meaning of census-like numbers can vary with genre and purpose. Where possible, then, references to numbers will be identified as biblical record versus modern scholarly estimate. One aspect of the campaign that warrants emphasis is its deliberate cultural element. The destruction of the temple was not merely a military act, it was a political symbol. Empires understood the power of ritual centers. To deprive a people of their sacred space was to interrupt the public life that bound communities together. The removal of sacred objects and the burning of the temple signal an attempt in practical and symbolic terms, to assert dominance and to delegitimize the city as a religious center. That is why the Babylonian actions have been read by some ancient authors and many modern scholars as acts of cultural eradication as much as tactical conquest. Another element was Babylon's use of psychological warfare through deportation and hostage policy. By taking elites to Babylon, the empire created a twofold effect. It denuded the homeland of leadership and created a cadre of assimilated or co-opted individuals who might serve imperial interests. Daniel and his companions are the best-known examples in the biblical tradition. Their story becomes an illustration of young elites shaped by the imperial center. But beyond individual anecdotes, the policy reshaped the demographic and cultural landscape of Judah, producing a diaspora that would have long-term implications for identity and religious life. We must also consider how warfare in the ancient Near East was embedded in economic logic. Empires relied upon tribute, labor, and secure commerce routes. The cost of maintaining garrisoned territories and supply lines justified, from an imperial perspective, decisive action against rebellious vassals. Nebuchadnezzar's campaign against Jerusalem was therefore not merely punitive. It was a recalibration of control over a region that stood between major imperial powers and lucrative trade corridors. This historical analysis leads directly to the theological question that shadows every recounting of Jerusalem's fall. Why did God allow this to happen? The prophetic literature is candid and sometimes brutal in its examination. Jeremiah frames the catastrophe as divine judgment tied to covenantal unfaithfulness. Lamentations reads the ruins through a lens of mourning, asking painful questions about suffering. Ezekiel, from the exile, represents the destruction as part of a prophetic trajectory with both warning and eventual hope. As a documentary grounded in historical method, we must be careful not to assert any single theological conclusion as empirically proven. The texts themselves make theological claims. They are part of the evidence about how contemporaries understood the events. But the question of divine causality lies ultimately beyond the reach of historical method. What history can do is show us the human mechanisms, decisions, strategies, technologies, and political calculations that brought Jerusalem to ruin, and to show how those events were then interpreted by those who survived, and by later memory makers. The fall of Jerusalem also resonates with questions about heritage and cultural loss. The burning of the temple, the removal of artifacts, and the scattering of populations mean that centuries of ritual life and local traditions were disrupted. Archaeologists and historians now attempt to reconstruct what was lost, recovering fragments of pottery, inscriptions, and structural remains to reassemble a picture of daily life and worship practices prior to the disaster. Museums and collections that hold artifacts with Judean provenance remind us that material culture travels and that the spoils of war remain part of long chains of custody and meaning. There is another modern angle to explore. Military historians and strategists still study the Babylonian campaign because it yields lessons about logistics, the value of intelligence, and the economies of prolonged siege warfare. The Babylonians demonstrated that patient application of resources, maintaining supply lines, rotating troops, investing in engineering, could overcome even the most fortified position. Their campaign against Jerusalem is studied as an example of how planning and state capacity can substitute for overwhelming numbers of soldiers on a battlefield. Yet strategy cannot be separated from suffering. The biblical witnesses insist upon the human cost: thousands displaced, families ruptured, entire social structures upended. Lamentations, in its sequence of poems, gives a voice to the bereaved and the dispossessed. Jeremiah records images of survivors who are forced to reconcile their shattered expectations with a future lived in exile. These are not abstract numbers on a map. They are communities whose memory and identity were reconfigured forever. Two final details are worth underlining because they anchor the narrative in time and place. First, the capture and punishment of Zedekiah is recorded in 2 Kings 25 and Jeremiah 52 as a grim denouement, the execution of his sons before him and his blinding followed by exile. That sequence illustrates how royal defeat was enacted to produce public terror and deter further insurrections. Second, the burning of the temple and the wider sack in early August of 586 BCE are given as the final symbolic acts of the campaign, marking the end of a political and religious era in Judah. When we step back from the particulars, Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem appears as both a military masterclass and a moral catastrophe. It combined diplomatic foresight with punitive force, engineering skill with a willingness to inflict profound social dislocation. The Babylonians achieved their strategic ends. They neutralized a troublesome vassal, secured trade routes, and incorporated valuable human and material resources into the imperial center. For Judah, the cost was near total. Political autonomy was lost, the central sanctuary was destroyed, and a people were scattered. The biblical authors and later interpreters would wrestle with these facts. For Jeremiah and Lamentations, the fall was a theological rupture calling for reflection and penitence. For Ezekiel and the exilic community, it became the context in which identity was reimagined in a foreign land. For modern historians, it is a case study in statecraft and military innovation. For archaeologists, it provides layers and fragments to reconstruct a vanished urban world. There is no simple answer to the final question, why did God allow this? The prophetic texts offer one set of answers tied to covenant fidelity, but historical analysis points to imperial politics and military pragmatism. The tension between theological interpretation and military explanation remains a space for conversation rather than closure. What is beyond doubt is that the fall of Jerusalem reshaped the ancient world and left a legacy that would be felt for generations. If this account has drawn you in and you value careful historical exploration of biblical events, please like and subscribe to support more documentaries of this nature. In closing, consider the long shadow cast by the events of 586 BCE. The destruction of the temple and the deportation of elites did not erase Judean identity, it transformed it. New liturgies, new theological reflections, and new community practices arose in exile, many of which would influence the later development of Judaism. Archaeological surveys remind us that cities can recover and cultures can adapt even after catastrophic rupture. Nebuchadnezzar's campaign is studied not only for its efficacy as a military endeavor, but also as a study in the costs of imperial ambition. For those who want to continue the story, our next program traces how life continued in exile and how prophetic voices in Babylon reshaped the future of a dispersed people. Click the video on screen to learn how Jerusalem's survivors rebuilt identity and faith in a new context. The story of how Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem is both an account of statecraft and an indictment of warfare's human toll. It is chronicled in 2 Kings 24:25 and Jeremiah 52, lamented in Lamentations, and reinterpreted by Ezekiel. It is corroborated by archaeological layers and debated in modern scholarship. Above all, it is a reminder that the strategies of empires are enacted on streets where families live, worship, and hope, and that the consequences of those strategies ripple across centuries.